Silas Rourke didn't knock. He rode straight through Mara Whitlock's gate, like he already owned the place, 3 men behind him, the county assessor sweating in his Sunday coat, and a smirk on his face that said he'd already won before a single word left his mouth. He looked down at her from his horse. Really looked the way men like him do when they want you to feel small. His eyes swept over her heavy frame, her calloused hands, the dirt still on her boots from morning work. "Thought you'd be smart," he said, loud enough for every neighbor watching through the fence to hear. "Turns out you're just like every other fool who thought they could take something from this county without paying what it's worth." Mara didn't flinch, but her hands tightened around the fence post until her knuckles went white. If you've ever stood in front of someone who had power, money, and absolutely no intention of letting you win, you already know exactly how she felt in that moment. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to you, stories about ordinary people who refuse to quit when the whole world told them they should, please take a second right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because some of you are watching from places I've never even imagined, and that means everything. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Mara Whitlock stepped off the stage in Copper Hollow, she was carrying everything she had in one carpet bag and a leather purse tucked so far inside her coat that she could feel the hard edges of it against her ribs with every breath. Nobody offered to help her down from the coach. The driver tossed her bag from and it landed in the dust, and he was already gathering the reins before she'd finished picking it up. She didn't say anything about it. She was used to people deciding, without asking, how much help a woman like her deserved. Copper Hollow wasn't what the land agent's letter had described. The letter had used words like promising and growing and full of opportunity. What Mara found was a main street that looked like it hadn't been swept since before the war, a general store with a cracked front window, and about 40 people trying very hard not to stare at her while obviously staring at her. She was 26 years old, alone, very heavy in a way that frontier towns associated with either wealth or weakness, and she clearly wasn't wealthy. And she had come a long way from Ohio with a plan that, if she was being honest with herself, sounded almost as foolish to her as it was going to sound to everyone else. She asked the mansman sweeping outside the hardware store where she could find the land office. He pointed without looking up. She walked the entire length of the main street carrying that carpet bag, and she felt every single pair of eyes follow her, and she kept her chin level the whole time, because her mother had told her once that the chin is the first thing people read, and if you let your chin drop, you've already handed them the conversation. The land office was staffed by a clerk named DeWitt, who had a thin mustache and the particular manner of a man who considered paperwork a form of personal power. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "Help you. I'm here about the Briar Ridge property," she said. "The 60-acre lot listed for back taxes." He pulled out a ledger and ran his finger down the page with the slow deliberateness of a man who wants you to understand how much he knows and how little you do. "That'd be the old Hatch parcel," he said. "You sure you're reading the right listing?" "I'm sure. It's mesquite scrub, mostly, some rock outcroppings. Creek's been dry 3 years. Last 3 owners gave it up, rather than keep paying taxes on it." He paused. "It's not what you'd call productive land. What's the price?" he told her. She didn't blink. She opened her purse right there on his counter, counted out the bills, and placed them in a neat stack between them. DeWitt looked at the money. He looked at her. He wrote up the deed. When she walked out with that paper in her hand, she heard him say something to the man waiting behind her, and she heard the other man laugh, and she kept walking. She found a room at the boarding house, run by a widow named Clara Beecham, who had the sharp, assessing eyes of a woman who'd seen everything twice and wasn't surprised by much anymore. Clara showed her the room, small, clean, one window facing east, and told her the rate. And when Mara paid for the first 2 weeks in advance, Clara's expression shifted very slightly, the way people's expressions shift when they realize they may have underestimated someone. "You know what you're getting with that land?" Clara asked. "I know what everyone thinks I'm getting," Mara said. "That's different." Clara studied her for a moment. Then she said, "There's an old woman, Vesna Marek, has a little place about a mile east of Briar Ridge. Czech woman, been here 30 years. If you're going out there alone, You should introduce yourself to her first. Why? Because she's the only person in this county who actually knows what's in that ground. Mara wrote the name down. She ate supper alone in her room that night, bread and dried beef she'd brought from the last town, and she spread her deed out on the bed and looked at it in the lamplight. 60 acres. Paid in full. She had just under $40 left to her name, which wasn't enough to do what she needed to do, but it was enough to begin. She'd learned, growing up in a house where money was always slightly less than enough. That beginning was the most important part. You couldn't plan everything from inside your own head. You had to get into the work and let the work teach you what the next step was. The next morning, she borrowed a horse from Clara's stable boy and rode out to see her land. It was worse than the clerk had described. Briar Ridge was a tangle of mesquite so thick and armed with thorns that you couldn't walk 20 feet into it without being torn. The ground underneath was rock-hard clay laced with limestone. There was no water visible anywhere. What had once been a fence line was now just a series of rotting posts connected by rusted wire that sagged in long, defeated curves. She sat on that borrowed horse for a long time and just looked at it. A woman who has come this far doesn't turn back, she told herself. That's not wisdom, that's just arithmetic. There's nowhere else to go. She rode east until she found a small, tidy property with a stone foundation house and a garden that was doing remarkable things despite the hard soil. An old woman was working the garden with her back to Mara, moving the way old women move when they've spent their whole lives in physical labor, slowly but without wasted motion. Mrs. Merrick? Mara called from the gate. The old woman turned. She had a broad, weathered face, bright dark eyes, and white hair pinned under a faded headscarf. She looked at Mara the way Clara had carefully, without the mockery Mara had already grown accustomed to from the rest of the town. "You're the one that bought the hatchland," Vesna said. It wasn't a question. Word travels fast. Out here, it's all we've got instead of entertainment. Vesna set down her trowel and walked to the gate. She was shorter than Mara, square-built, and she moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had made peace with her surroundings a long time ago. "Come in. I'll make coffee." They sat at a wooden table inside, and Vesna made coffee so strong it could have stripped paint, and she listened while Mara explained what she intended to do. When Mara finished, there was a silence. "You know what most people do with land like that?" Vesna asked. "Give up," Mara said. "Give up," Vesna agreed. "Or try to fight it straight on, which is the same thing, only slower." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "You cannot clear that mesquite by hand. Not 60 acres. Not with 20 men and 10 years. It'll grow back faster than you can cut it." "I know," Mara said. "I'm not planning to fight it by hand." And she explained about the goats. Vesna was quiet for a long moment after that. Then something happened at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the look of someone who has been waiting a long time for someone else to figure out something obvious. "Brush goats," Vesna said. 50 of them, if I can find them at the right price. I know a man outside of Laredo who breeds Spanish brush goats." Vesna picked up her cup. "He owes me a favor. A fairly significant favor. I think I can get you 50 animals for what most people would pay for 15. Mara stared at her. "Why would you do that?" Vesna looked at her steadily. "Because I've been watching this town ignore perfectly good ideas for 30 years because the idea came from someone they didn't think deserved to have one. And I am very, very tired of it." The goats arrived 3 weeks later, 50 of them, ranging from ancient matriarchs with knowing yellow eyes to leggy young animals that bounced off each other and off the trailer walls with complete disregard for their own dignity. They were not beautiful. They smelled extraordinary. The stable boy who helped unload them, a quiet young man named Caleb Pike, spent the better part of an hour getting a particularly stubborn old buck away from the trailer gate by himself without complaint or drama. And something about the patient, methodical way he worked made Mara decide she could trust him. "You ever worked with goats before?" she asked him. "Pigs, horses, a little cattle," he said. "Goats are smarter than any of them, is what I hear." "Smarter and meaner," she said, "but useful." He looked at the herd and then looked at Briar Ridge, where the mesquite scrub sat thick and hostile in the morning heat. "You're going to run them into that?" "All 50. Every morning." He thought about it. "You need someone to help watch them?" She couldn't pay him much. She told him that plainly. He said he'd work mornings before his shift at the livery and see how it went. That was how Caleb Pike became the second person on the Briar Ridge payroll, which at that point consists of two people, $40 in reserve, and 50 goats with no fence worth mentioning. The first day, she opened the gate and pushed the herd into the mesquite. Nothing in Copper Hollow's history had ever prepared her for the sound of 50 hungry goats, discovering that everything they'd ever wanted was right in front of them. They moved through those briars like water, finding the lowest path. They stripped leaves from branches that Mara couldn't reach with an axe. They chewed bark. They ate thorns. They pushed through gaps that no human being could have navigated without serious injury, and they did it with the cheerful, oblivious confidence of animals for whom this was simply Tuesday. Mara followed behind them, brush hook, cutting the weakened trunks that the goats had stripped, dragging debris to the edges, and marking in her head the shape of the ground underneath. The work was brutal. She was not a small woman, and she was not a strong woman. In the way that frontier life typically defined strength, she couldn't heave 50-pound fence posts or wrestle grown cattle. What she had was endurance. She could work steady and slow when everyone else had burned themselves out by noon. She could think while she worked, which was something a lot of people couldn't do, because thinking while doing something hard requires a particular kind of mental toughness that doesn't get talked about much. Caleb watched her that first week and didn't say much. He was that kind of person, more listener than talker, more watcher than performer. But on the fifth day, when she was struggling to drag a particularly dense mesquite trunk out of the path, and he moved to help without being asked, he said, "You've done this kind of work before." "Not this kind exactly," she said. "Work where you had to prove something." She thought about that while they hauled the trunk together. "I've spent most of my life doing work that other people assumed I couldn't do, so yes. I suppose that's familiar ground." He didn't answer, but she could tell by the way he adjusted his grip that he understood what she meant. Silas Rourke came by the end of that second week. She'd heard about Rourke before she ever saw him. Clara had described him one evening in the same flat, careful tone people use for weather systems and other things that cause damage and can't be reasoned with. He owned most of the large cattle operations east of town. He'd been quietly absorbing neighboring parcels for a decade, always at moments of weakness, drought, death, debt, always at prices that looked like mercy and functioned like theft. He rode up alone, which she'd learned later was his way. He never brought muscle when he came to talk. He didn't need it. He was a tall man, well-dressed for the frontier, with a face that had been handsome once and had cured into something harder and more permanent. He sat his horse at her new fence line. She and Caleb had restrung nearly a quarter-mile of wire in the past week, and he looked at the herd working through the mesquite, and he looked at her, and then he looked at the herd again. "Interesting approach," he said. "Thank you," she said, because she'd learned early that taking a compliment from a man who doesn't mean it as a compliment is the fastest way to take the air out of what he's trying to do. "You know that land's not going to be worth anything," he said. Even if you clear it. The soil underneath is hardpan clay. Nothing grows in hardpan clay. A lot of things grow in hardpan clay with the right preparation," she said. "The goats will fertilize as they clear. Soil conditions change." He looked at her with the measured patience of someone explaining something to a child. "I've worked this land 40 years. I know what grows and what doesn't." "I'm sure you do," she said pleasantly. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Rourke? Or were you just passing?" A small something moved through his expression. Not anger. Rourke was too experienced for obvious anger. Something more careful. "If you find yourself in over your head," he said, "and most people do with land like this, the offer stands. I'll give you fair market for the parcel." "Fair market by whose assessment?" she asked. He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't involve the eyes at all. "By mine," he said, and he rode away. That night, lying on her cot in the small house she'd been slowly making livable, one repaired wall at a time, one patched window at a time, she stared at the ceiling and listened to the goats moving in their pen outside and thought about what it meant that Silas Rourke had ridden out here personally to make an offer on. Land everyone else in town still called worthless. He didn't believe it was worthless. He'd never believed it was worthless, which meant there was something here she hadn't found yet. She turned that thought over and over in her mind until she fell asleep. Outside, the old buck, the big gray one with the stubborn eyes that she'd started calling Stone, because he reminded her of someone who decided immovability was a personality moved once in the pen and then was still. Whatever Rourke knew, she was going to find it before he took it from her. The only questions was whether the drought that everyone said was coming would give her enough time. She didn't sleep well that night, and she hadn't expected to. The thought that had lodged itself in her mind before she drifted off, that Rourke had come out personally, that a man who'd spent 40 years in this county buying land at the lowest possible moment, had ridden to her fence line within 2 weeks of her arrival. That thought was still there in the morning, sitting right behind her eyes where she couldn't ignore it. She got up before first light, made coffee on the small iron stove she'd hauled in from the general store on a borrowed wagon, and stood at her east-facing window while the sky went from black to the particular dark blue that exists for about 12 minutes before sunrise, and she thought about what a man like Rourke would know that she didn't. She'd asked Vesna about it. The following afternoon, when she rode over to return tools she'd borrowed and found the old woman already waiting at the gate, with coffee poured, as though she'd been expecting company. He came out himself, Mara said. Second week. Vesna didn't look surprised. He came out when the Hatch family first posted the property, too, she said. And when the Alderman brothers had it before that. He's been watching that parcel since I've been here. Why? Vesna sat with that a moment, turning her cup in both hands. This land has very old limestone underneath. Very deep. When the Hatch boy was still alive, before he lost the place, he told me his grandfather had started digging a well up on the high point and had to abandon it when the money ran out. But before he quit, he said the ground changed. Got cooler. Damper. More than it should have been, given the depth. Mara set her cup down. He thought there might be water, Vesna said. Deep water. The kind that doesn't follow surface drought. But he never had the resources to verify it. And then the family fell apart and the land went for taxes. And whoever bought it next was in too much of a hurry to get out to look carefully. And Rourke knew about this. Rourke knows everything that has ever happened on every piece of ground within 30 miles of this town, Vesna said flatly. That's what makes him dangerous. It's not money. It's information. Mara rode back to Briar Ridge in the long afternoon light and stood at the highest point of the property, where the mesquite grew thinner around a cluster of limestone outcroppings, and looked at the ground. She looked at it for a long time. She couldn't see anything yet. The goats hadn't worked this section, and the scrub was still too dense, but she noted the location in her mind like a marked page, something to return to. The first summer settled in hard and mean. The heat came early that year, the kind of dry baking heat that southern Texas pushed up from the Gulf in waves, and it turned the clay ground to something close to ceramic by mid-June. Every morning Mara opened the gate, and the herd moved into the scrub, and every morning she followed, and the hours between sunrise and the brutal midday were filled with the sounds of goats working brush, the rhythmic thud of her axe, and the occasional distant creak of Caleb's brush hook dragging through something stubborn. They didn't talk much while they worked. Caleb was constitutionally quiet, and Mara had grown up in a house where silence was something to be respected rather than filled, and so they fell into a working rhythm that felt more like a long friendship than what it actually was, which was two people who'd known each other about 6 weeks. It was Caleb who noticed the grass first. He stopped one afternoon in a section they'd cleared the previous month and crouched down, and when Mara came up beside him, she saw what he was looking at, thin green threads pushing up through the cracked clay in a small rough circle, maybe 4 feet across. In the surrounding ground, there was nothing but bare-baked clay, but right there something was coming up. Native grama grass, he said. Hasn't been here in years, if it's been here at all. The goats, she said, fertilizing as they go, maybe. He stood. He was a careful young man, not inclined to certainty. But see how it's shaped? It's not spread out even. It's kind of circular. She looked. He was right. The growth was tight and roughly circular, as though something underneath was pushing it up from a specific point. Probably a root pocket, she said, because that was the most sensible explanation. Different moisture content in a confined area. Caleb didn't argue, but she noticed he looked back at it twice as they moved on. By July they had cleared 5 acres. It sounds like nothing. 5 acres from 60, but when you've done it by the hardest method available by hand, in Texas summer heat, on an uneven limestone ridge with 50 animals that did what they wanted, regardless of what you wanted, 5 acres. Felt like a different kind of accomplishment entirely. It felt earned in a way that purchased things never do. The goats had also, in that time, reproduced. 3 of the older does had kidded, producing 7 healthy animals that added themselves to the herd with no ceremony and immediately began eating everything within reach. Vesna came out to see them and nodded approvingly, and then she showed Mara something that changed the economics of the entire operation. The milk, Vesna said. You're wasting it. They're feeding the kids, Mara said. The kids don't need all of it. Pull it off in the mornings and evenings. She handed Mara a small, dense round of pale cheese wrapped in cloth. This is from my 2 does. 3 pounds from last week alone. I sell it to Clara for the boarding house and to the doctor's wife who has a taste for it. She paused. Your herd is 50 animals. Even milking a third of them would give you more than I make in a month. Mara tasted the cheese. It was sharp and rich and a little grassy, and it was very good. She bought 2 copper pots from the hardware store the following week, which put a painful dent in her reserve, and Vesna came every 3rd morning for the next 3 weeks, and stood beside her in the pre-dawn dark and taught her not patiently. Exactly, because Vesna wasn't built for patience, but precisely how to set the rennet, how to press the curtain, how to salt the wheels, how to age them on the plank shelves. Caleb had built inside the coolest corner of the stone outbuilding. The cheese was not good at first. The first 2 batches were too soft and too mild, and had a faint off flavor that Vesna identified as contamination from a crack in one of the pots. The 3rd batch crumbled. The 4th was acceptable. The 5th, 6 weeks in, was genuinely good, sharp, and clean, with a slight mineral note that came, Vesna said, from the particular character of the limestone ground the goats were browsing. Clara bought the first wheel without even tasting it first, which told Mara something about how Clara operated. People in this town will try something they don't know if someone they trust puts it in front of them, Clara said, setting the cheese behind the counter where her boarding house guests would see it. They won't try something unknown from someone they don't trust yet. And they don't trust me. They don't know what to make of you, Clara said, which was a distinction she seemed to consider important. That's different. Unknown isn't the same as hostile. Some of them are hostile, Mara said, thinking of the man outside the hardware store 2 months ago who'd watched her walk past and said, just loud enough, something about what good land is worth when a fool buys it. Some of them, Clara agreed without flinching. But most of them are just waiting to see what happens. People out here don't commit to an opinion until they have to. It costs too much. August came, and the temperature didn't break, and the sky turned white instead of blue, and the creek that was already barely a trickle stopped running entirely. This was the drought that the old-timers had been predicting, the one that came every 7 years or so, deep and dry and stubborn, the kind of drought that reorganized the county's power structures, because it reorganized who had water and who didn't. The first sign was the public well in town, dropping 3 feet in a week. DeWitt, the land clerk, posted a notice about conservation. 2 of Rourke's neighboring ranchers reduced their cattle herds preemptively, selling off animals they couldn't afford to water through the dry season. Mara watched all of this from Briar Ridge with the specific anxiety of someone who knows the storm is coming, but can't yet calculate where it'll hit hardest. Her goats still had water she'd had Caleb dig out and deepen the small cistern on the north side of the property, and she'd been filling it by hauling from town when the price was still low, but it wasn't going to last the full dry season at the rate the herd needed. She was up at the limestone. Outcroppings almost every evening that August. After the goats were penned, and the day's work was done, sitting on the rock in the cooling air and looking at the cleared ground around her. The goats had worked the edges of this section now, and the mesquite was thinner. She could see the ground more clearly than she'd been able to when she first stood here. There was a large flat stone near the highest point that she'd been meaning to investigate. It was too regular for natural limestone, too flat, too consistent, sitting slightly proud of the surrounding ground, as though it had been placed rather than formed. She'd meant to look at it a dozen times, and always been too tired, or too distracted, or too focused on whatever the next problem was. One evening, she brought a crowbar. She wedged it under the edge of the stone and pushed, and the stone didn't move. She adjusted her position and pushed again, and it still didn't move. and she stepped back and looked at it with the specific frustration of someone who has been working hard all day and would like something. Just one thing: to cooperate. She went back to the house and told Caleb about it the next morning. He came up with her after the goats were set, and they both stood looking at the stone. He crouched and ran his hand along the edge of it where it met the ground, and then looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "It's been mortared," he said. "Look here, this edge. Someone sealed it." She crouched beside him. He was right. There was a thin line of old crumbling mortar running along the base, where the stone met the surrounding rock, deliberately sealed. Someone had set this stone over something and then fixed it in place so it wouldn't move easily. "Why would someone mortar a flat stone into the ground?" she asked. Caleb stood up and looked around at the high point of the ridge, at the way the ground fell away in all directions from this spot, and she watched his face while he thought it through. "Capstone," he said finally. "You put a capstone over something you want to protect, something you want to come back to." He looked at her. "Or something you don't want anyone else to find." That evening she did something she hadn't planned to do yet. She rode to Vesna's and told her what they'd found. Vesna's face didn't move for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "The Hatch grandfather's well. You think it's a well cover. I think it's exactly what it sounds like." Vesna stood up from her chair and walked to the window and stood looking out at her own garden, where the plants were struggling in the heat but surviving because she watered them, by hand, every evening, with water she carried from her own deep cistern. He dug as far as he could, and then he couldn't go further. But he didn't want anyone else to find what he'd found. So he capped it and sealed it. And then he died, and his family fell apart, and the land changed hands 3 times, and no one knew to look. "What did he find?" Mara asked. Vesna turned from the window. "That's what you need to determine." The next morning, Mara woke before the goats started making noise, which meant she woke before 4 in the morning, and she lay in the dark and thought about what she was about to attempt. She was not a woman. Given to drama, she'd spent too much of her life being told. Her situation was more dramatic than it needed to be, as though her existence itself was a problem requiring narrative, but she understood that what happened in the next hours might determine whether the past 4 months had been a beginning or just a long, expensive, very tiring mistake. She got up and she made coffee, and she woke Caleb, who was sleeping in the small room she'd partitioned off in the stone outbuilding, and she handed him coffee without explaining, and he took it without asking, because he was, as she'd come to understand, genuinely one of the better human beings she had encountered, which was a thing she would never say out loud because she was from Ohio, and people from Ohio do not say things like that. Most of its windows were dark. They went up to the ridge with 2 crowbars, a lantern, a coil of rope, a bucket, and a 50-foot length of chain that Caleb had borrowed from the livery with the explanation that he needed it for fence repair, which was true in the sense that Briar Ridge always needed fence repair and false in every other sense. The morning was still dark. The goats were quiet in their pen. The air had that particular pre-dawn quality of being cooler than it would be for the rest of the day, a temporary mercy from the heat. They worked the crowbars under opposite edges of the stone and pushed together, and the mortar crumbled. It had been sitting there for 30 years and was more memory than substance at this point. And the stone shifted, and they reset their leverage and pushed again, and it moved more, and then with a deep scraping sound that seemed very loud. In the silence, it slid aside, and cold air hit both of them in the face. Not just cool. Cold. The kind of cold that comes from deep underground. From places where the temperature of the earth levels out and stays constant regardless of what the surface is doing. Mara held the lantern over the opening. The hole below was roughly 2 feet across, stone-lined, dropping down into darkness. The walls were smooth, and the stonework was careful. Someone had taken time with this, had done it with intention and skill. It was not a dug well abandoned in haste. It was a finished structure, covered and concealed. She tied the rope to the bucket handle. The chain she'd worried about, how far did she need to go? But Caleb had already begun lowering the bucket on the rope, letting it out hand over hand, and they both counted the knots he'd tied at 5-foot intervals. 10 feet, 15, 20. The lantern light didn't reach the bottom. 30 feet. The rope was still going. 40 feet. Then a sound, a distant echoing splash, like a stone dropped into something deeper than a basin. Caleb stopped. They both heard it. He looked at her. "Pull it up," she said. He pulled, and the rope came up, And when the bucket cleared the rim of the well, it was not just damp, it was overflowing, water sheeting off the sides, clean and cold in the early morning air. It caught the lamplight. She put her hand in it, and the cold was startling, the kind of cold that makes you pull back instinctively before you lean in closer. She brought it to her mouth. Cold. Faint minerals, the clean taste of deep limestone. No sulfur, no iron, no brackishness. Just cold, clean, deep water. Caleb was watching her face. "It's good," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she'd intended, and she was not going to discuss why. He looked down into the well and then back at her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, because there was nothing adequate to say. This was the thing that Rourke had suspected was here. This was what the Hatch grandfather had found and hidden and lost. This was what 3 subsequent owners had walked over and sold away without knowing. And this was what Mara Whitlock, 26 years old, from Ohio, very fat and very alone, and according to the entire town of Copper Hollow entirely in over her head, had bought for the price of back taxes on 60 acres of worthless mesquite scrub. "Don't tell anyone," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Not yet," she said. "Not until I know how to protect it." He nodded once, the way he always did when he agreed with something not emphatic, just steady. She would learn later that he'd told no one intentionally, that he'd kept the secret as naturally and completely as he did. Everything else that was asked of him, and that the way it eventually came out was through a single careless moment on a bad afternoon. But that was, neither them knew it yet. She replaced the stone over the well. They didn't mortar it back, but they positioned it carefully, and she walked back down to the house in the early light, with the rope coiled over her shoulder and her mind running through everything she would need to do to secure what she'd found before Rourke found out she'd found it. The following week was the most productive of her life and the most exhausting. She rode to the county seat and spoke to a land lawyer, a young, overworked man named Aldridge who had ink on his collar and the distracted air of someone managing too many cases, and she asked about the legal framework around water rights on private land. He told her. It was complicated, as these things always were, but the broad shape of it was this. Water on private land was attached to the land, and the land was hers, and unless the county could demonstrate that the water source was connected to a shared aquifer under active communal claim which would require an assessment and a formal assessment petition, her rights were solid. She asked how someone might challenge those rights. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her more carefully than he had at the start of the conversation. "You asking because someone's going to try?" "I'm asking so I understand the ground I'm standing on. The most viable approach would be reassessment," he said slowly. "Most of it's if someone could argue that the land was undervalued at the time of purchase, that material information about its value was concealed or unknown, they could petition for a tax reassessment. If the reassessment resulted in a significantly higher valuation, the owner would be responsible for back taxes at the new rate. If they couldn't pay, they'd have to sell," she said, "or lose the property to the county." He said, yes. She paid his fee and rode home, and she sat in her house that evening and did the arithmetic of her situation carefully. She had the well. She had the land. She had no money to speak of. The cheese was selling. The goats were thriving. But she was weeks away from anything like financial stability. If Rourke moved quickly, if he found out and moved on a reassessment before she had reserves to absorb it, she would lose everything. She needed to change the equation before he had a chance to set it. The drought worsened through September. The public well in Copper Hollow dropped at another 4 feet. A family on the East Road lost their cattle herd over 2 weeks, 43 animals, and the smell of it drifted into town on hot afternoons. Rourke was moving too. 3 of her neighboring ranchers sold to him within 30 days, all at prices that Clara described with a flat, controlled fury that Mara had come to recognize as the old widow's version of barely contained outrage. He waited them out, Clara said. Waited until they had no choice and then offered them enough to get out of the county, but not enough to start over. He's done this before, Mara said. It's what he does. It's all he does. Clara set a plate down with slightly more force than necessary. He's very good at it. Mara thought about Rourke's offer to her, his measured calm, the way he'd held his horse still while he looked at her land, the quality of control in his voice that comes from decades of being certain you'll eventually get what you want. She thought about the look on his face, when she'd said fair market by whose assessment, and the way that small flicker of something had moved through his expression. He hadn't expected her to understand the mechanism. That was her advantage, thin as it was. He'd underestimated the specific nature of what he was dealing with. Not her capability. In general, men like Rourke were usually smart enough to take capability seriously, but the particular capability of a woman who'd spent her whole life having to understand the rules of systems that hadn't been designed for her benefit. She'd been reading the rules her entire life. She just hadn't been in a position to use that knowledge for herself for now. The moment that changed everything happened on a Thursday in late September. Late afternoon, when Caleb came back from a supply run to town looking like a man who'd done something he wished he could undo. He came into the yard where she was working the cheese press, and he stood there for a moment without speaking, and that alone told her what she needed to know, because Caleb was not a man who stood around uncertain about what to say. "What happened?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Henderson asked me directly," he said, "at the feed store. His family's got 3 kids and no water, and the oldest is sick, and he grabbed my arm and he asked me straight out if it was true that we had water up on Briar Ridge." She set down what she was doing. "What did you tell him?" Caleb looked at his boots and then back at her. "I told him I couldn't say," which told him yes. "Yes," he said. She stood there. He stood there. The goats were making their late afternoon sounds in the pen, the usual chorus of complaints about nothing and everything simultaneously. "How many people were in the feed store?" she asked. 6, 7. Henderson wasn't quiet about it. She closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 full second. Then she opened them. "All right," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. And she could hear that he meant it in that whole uncomplicated way that people mean things when they don't have complicated relationships with honesty. "I tried it was going to happen," she said. "I just needed a few more weeks." She looked at the ridge, where the capstone was sitting over the well in the long afternoon light. "How many days do you think before Rourke hears it?" Caleb thought about it honestly, the way he did things. "By morning," he said. "Someone in that store works for him." She looked at him. "Henderson's neighbor Pitch does fence work for Rourke's East operation," Caleb said. "He was there. By morning." She had one evening to decide what she was going to do with a well full of cold, clean water, in the middle of the worst drought the county had seen in a decade, before the most powerful man in the territory figured out she had it. She went inside and she sat at her table and she thought she was not going to be able to hide this. That moment had passed. She was not going to be able to develop it quietly and build the kind of financial buffer that would let her weather a tax challenge. She was too exposed, too early, too broke. If she tried to protect the well by secrecy, Rourke would move on a reassessment within the week, and she'd be fighting that battle with $40 and a cheese press. But there was another way to protect something. You make it so visible, so communal, so completely embedded in the daily life of the people around you that taking it away requires taking it away from everyone. You make it not yours alone. You make it theirs. She sat with that for a long time. There's a version of this story where Mara Whitlock locked her gate, posted a guard, and fought Silas Rourke for her water in the county courts for 3 years. She might have won. She might not have. It would have been a different story entirely. Instead, she got up from the table, went to find Caleb, and told him to start clearing the path to the well first thing in the morning. "For what?" he asked. "For people," she said. "We're going to need to be able to move a lot of traffic up that ridge." Most of its windows were dark. He looked at her for a moment with the careful expression he wore when he was trying to determine whether what he was hearing was what he thought he was hearing. "We're opening it," he said. "We're opening it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Rourke's not going to like that." "No," she said. "He's not." Outside, the old buck stone moved once in the pen and settled. The night came on hot and still and starless, the kind of night that feels like the land itself is holding its breath, waiting to see what the people on it are going to do next. In the house, Mara sat back down at her table and started writing out the terms on a piece of paper. She wrote slowly, because she wanted every word to mean exactly what she needed it to mean, and nothing more and nothing less. 5 cents per bucket for those who could pay. 1 hour of honest work for every 10 buckets, for those who had time but not money. Free, no questions. For families with young children who had neither. No hoarding, no resale, no taking more than was genuinely needed. She read it back twice. Then she put the pencil down and looked at what she'd written and thought about whether she was afraid, and concluded that she was, considerably, but that this was the decision that made sense from the ground she was actually standing on, not from the ground she wished she were standing on. Tomorrow was going to tell her everything. She didn't sleep that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the nights before. Those had been anxious, the turning, circling kind of wakefulness that comes from not knowing what's coming. This was something else. This was the specific alertness of someone who has made a decision they can't take back and is now simply waiting for the consequences to arrive. She got up at 3 and checked the piece of paper on the table. She'd read it so many times from memory, but she read it again anyway, looking for weaknesses, looking for the place where Rourke could get a hand in and pull. She didn't find one. What she'd written was simple enough that it couldn't be easily twisted, and generous enough that attacking it publicly would make him look like exactly what he was. That was the gamble, not the water. The water was real and solid and 50 feet below the limestone ridge, and it wasn't going anywhere. The gamble was whether the people of Copper Hollow were decent enough, when it came down to it, to recognize what she was doing and stand behind it, or whether Rourke's influence over this town ran deep enough that they'd watch her get dismantled and look at their boots while it happened. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. Then she went and woke Caleb. He was already awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, with his boots half on, which told her he hadn't slept much either. She gave him the list of things she needed done. Before the town started moving the path to the ridge cleared of the worst obstacles, the rope and bucket mechanism rigged properly so it could be operated by people who'd never worked a well, a rough sign posted at her gate with the terms written large enough to read from the road. "How do you want the sign to look?" he asked. "Clear," she said. Not pleading, not apologetic. Just the terms plain. He nodded and went to work. She rode to Vesna's before sunrise. The old woman was already up. Vesna was always already up, and she opened the door before Mara knocked, which at this point didn't surprise her at all. "I heard you coming down the road," Vesna said. "Come in." "I don't have time for coffee," Mara said. "I need to tell you what I've decided." Vesna listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Mara had come to value most about her. When Mara finished, Vesna was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark window. "He'll come," Vesna said. "Rourke, he'll hear this morning, and he'll be there by noon." "I know. And your plan is to be standing there when he arrives." "My plan is to have 30 families lined up at my fence before he gets there," Mara said, "with empty buckets." Vesna looked at her, then a long, careful look, the look of someone recalculating something they thought they'd already figured out. Then she said, "I'll bring the Hendersons and the Millers. I know the Bauer family lost their well last week." She paused. "Give me 2 hours." "I've got 2 hours," Mara said. She rode back to Briar Ridge and found Caleb already halfway up the ridge with a machete, clearing the path with the fast, efficient strokes of someone who knows exactly what he's doing and doesn't need to think about it. She went to the house and changed into her cleanest work clothes, which were not clean by most standards, but were the best she had, and she put the folded paper back in her pocket, and she stood at her gate, and she waited. The first people came before 7. It was the Henderson family, Tom Henderson, his wife Ruth, their 3 children ranging from about 4 to about 10, all of them carrying buckets of various sizes. Tom Henderson was a broad, red-faced man who Mara had seen in town a handful of times, always in motion, always looking like he was doing the arithmetic of some problem in his head. He was not a man who looked comfortable asking for anything, and the expression on his face as he approached her gate made that plain. He stopped about 10 feet back. He looked at the sign Caleb had posted. He looked at Mara. "This square," he said, nodding at the sign. "Everything on there is how it actually works." "Everything on there is how it works," she said. He looked at it again. His wife Ruth was holding the youngest child against her hip and watching Mara with an expression that was something between hope and the specific wariness of someone who has been disappointed enough times to hold hope at arm's length. "We've got no cash right now," Tom said. "The cattle took everything, but I can work." "Terms are on the sign," Mara said. 1 hour for 10 buckets. What do you know how to do?" He looked startled, as though he'd expected negotiation. "Fencing, mostly. Some stonework. Carpentry." I've got about 100 yards of fence line on the southern side that needs to be completely restrung, Mara said. Can you do that? Yes, he said. Then come back this afternoon, she said. Bring wire if you have it. I'll provide the posts. She stepped aside from the gate. Right now, take your water. Ruth Henderson looked at her as she passed through the gate, and it wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something quieter and more complicated than gratitude. The look of a woman who's been carrying something heavy and has just put it down for a moment. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The families came steadily after that. By 9 in the morning, there were 14 families on the path to the ridge, moving up in a rough procession with buckets and jugs and every container they could carry. Caleb was at the top, working the rope with a methodical steadiness that Mara would think about later. The image of him there at the well rim, lowering and raising the bucket in the morning light, arms working the rope, like he was built for exactly this one thing. Mara stayed at the gate. She read terms, answered questions, kept track of who was paying in cash and who was working off their water, and she did it all with the same flat, even manner she'd used with Rourke. Not warm, not cold, just steady. She'd noticed that steadiness worked better than warmth in a crisis. Warmth is reassurings. Steadiness is credible. By 10:30, there were 22 families. Word was moving through Copper Hollow fast. The way word moves in a small town when it's carrying something people desperately need. Most of it's in so dark, and see it happening, a man would try to fill his buckets, and on a pat out, he'd see someone coming the other direction, and they'd exchange a few words, and the new arrival would walk faster. Clara arrived at 11 with a wagon and 3 large wooden barrels, which she intended to fill for the boarding house, and she paid in cash without being asked, and then stood beside Mara at the gate for a while, watching the traffic. He's going to come, Clara said quietly. Same thing Vesna had said. I know. Half these people, if he pressures them, will fold, Clara said. She wasn't being unkind. She was being honest in the way she was always honest, the way that initially felt harsh, and then revealed itself as a form of respect. They owe him. Credit at his store, grazing rights on his land, favors going back years. He's got leverage. Not over their water, Morris said. That's the one thing he can't offer them right now. Clara looked at her sideways. You thought this through. I had one night, Mara said. But yes. Clara was quiet for a moment. The Bauer children are up there right now getting water, she said. Eldridge Bauer hasn't had 2 cents since April. Rourke bought his neighbor's land last month and cut off his access to the East Creek as part of the deal. Mara hadn't known that last part. He cut off the creek access? Legal, Clara said. The creek runs through what's now Rourke's property. He fenced it. She paused. Rourke doesn't do illegal things. He does things that are perfectly legal and function the same way. At 11:57, she would remember the approximate time because she'd been watching the angles of the sun and calculating how much longer she had Rourke arrived. He didn't come alone this time. He came with the county assessor, a thin man named Graft, who wore a coat that was too heavy for the weather and perpetually seemed to be somewhere he didn't want to be. He came with 2 other men she didn't recognize, both of them carrying ledgers. And he came with the particular energy of a man who believes he has arrived at exactly the right moment to end something cleanly. He looked at the families on the path to the ridge. He looked at the sign at the gate. He looked at Mara. And for just a moment, a fraction of a second, there and gone, she saw something she hadn't expected to see on his face. Not anger, not calculation. Something that was almost. The look of a man who has just realized the move he planned isn't available anymore. Then it was gone, replaced by the controlled, measured expression he probably wore to sleep. Miss Whitlock, he said. Mr. Rourke, she said. He looked at the families again. Some of them had stopped moving, watching. The Hendersons were coming back down the path with full buckets. Tom Hendert's windows were dark, and something stopped when he saw Rourke, and something shifted in his posture the particular way a man's body changes when he's near someone who has power over him, a kind of involuntary compression. Rourke let Tom see that he'd noticed. Then he looked back at Mara. I'm going to need to discuss something with you, he said. I'm listening, she said. She did not invite him through the gate. He glanced at Graft. Mr. Graft has some concerns about the original valuation of this property, given what's come to light about its resources. He paused on the word resources in a way that was meant to communicate exactly how much he knew and exactly how long he'd known it. There may need to be a reassessment. On what grounds? She asked. On the grounds that a significant subsurface water source constitutes material value that was not reflected in the original tax assessment. The property was assessed and listed publicly, she said. The price was set by the county. I paid what the county asked. The county assessed surface value, Rourke said. Subsurface resources are a different category. Graft of its windows were dark. Graft shifted uncomfortably in his too heavy coat, which told some Graft was not entirely convinced by the argument he'd been brought here to make. Mr. Graft, she said, looking directly at the assessor for the first time. How does the county typically handle this situation when a property owner improves the value of their land through their own labor and investment? Graft blinked. He clearly hadn't expected to be addressed directly. Improvements to property made by the owner after purchase, or that is, standard practice, is that they're credited to the owner and don't affect back tax calculations. And who discovered this water source? She asked. Graft looked at Rourke. Rourke's jaw was very slightly tight. That would be a matter of investigation, Rourke said. I can tell you who discovered it, Mara said. I did. With a rope, a bucket, and a crowbar. Because I bought land that everyone in this county told me was worthless, and I worked it, and I looked at it carefully, and I found what was there. She looked at Graft. Is there a legal mechanism that allows someone to claim ownership of a discovery made by someone else on someone else's legally purchased and fully paid property? Graft opened his mouth, closed it. Not a standard one, he said. Not anyone, she said. She said it quietly. Not triumphant, she knew better than to be triumphant, with Rourke standing 2 feet away, but clearly. And finally, the way you say something, when you've done the homework and you know you're right, and you need the other person to understand that you know. The families on the path had stopped moving entirely. Everyone was watching now. Mara was aware of every face: the Hendersons, the Bowers, Clara on her wagon, Vesna, who had appeared at the edge of the road at some point, without Mara noticing, standing with her arms folded and her dark eyes moving between Mara and Rourke with the look of someone watching a chess game they've been waiting 30 years to see played. Rourke was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't uncertainty, it was recalibration. There are other mechanisms available to the county, he said. I'd encourage you to consult a lawyer before you're too far into this. I already have, she said. His name is Aldridge. He's in the county seat. If Mr. Graft wants to initiate a formal assessment, proceeding, Mr. Aldridge is available to discuss the legal framework. She reached into her coat pocket and produced the piece of paper, not the terms paper, a different one, the address and availability of the lawyer, written in her clear, careful hand, and she held it out toward Graft, without looking away from Rourke. Graft took it. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. She made herself hold his gaze, not aggressively, just steadily, the same way she'd been doing things out here for 5 months. She was aware that her heart was hitting her ribs hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, but her face was doing what she needed it to do, which was nothing. You've prepared for this, Rourke said. I prepare for things, she said. Another silence. Behind him, one of the men with ledgers shifted his weight. Graft was studying the piece of paper she'd given him, with the intense focus of a man looking for an excuse not to be here. Then Rourke said, You can't run a public water supply indefinitely on one well. I'm not running a public water supply, she said. I'm a private property owner sharing a resource with my neighbors during a crisis, on terms I've set, that I can change or end at any time. She paused. There's no law against that either. He looked at the families again. He looked at the sign. He looked at her. And then something moved across sightless Rourke's face that she didn't expect and wouldn't fully understand until later, when she had time to think about it. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't defeat. It was something almost like recognition, the look of a man who has been in this business long enough to know when the ground has shifted under him in a way that can't be shifted back. He turned his horse. We'll be in touch, he said, over his shoulder. Mr. Graft knows where to find me, she said. He rode away. His men followed. Graft tucked her piece of paper into his coat pocket and rode after them without making eye contact with anyone, which told her more about Graft's private opinion of the morning than anything he'd said out loud. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Tom Henderson lifted his bucket and kept walking down the path, and this seemed to release everyone else, and the traffic started moving again. And Caleb's rope kept working, at the top of the ridge, and the morning went on. Mara turned back to the gate. Her hands, when she looked at them, were not entirely steady. She put them in her pockets. Vesna appeared at her elbow. "Well," the old woman said. "Well," Mara agreed. "He's not finished," Vesna said. "No," Mara said. "But I bought myself time." "Time for what?" Mara looked up the path toward the ridge. "Time for this to become something he can't take away without the whole county knowing exactly who he is." The days after Rourke's visit had a particular quality that Mara hadn't anticipated, which was industry. She'd expected tension. She'd expected continued hostility, or at minimum a careful, watchful distance from the people of Copper Hollow while they figured out what side of this they were on. What she hadn't expected was for Tom Expectant to show up the following morning with fencing wire and a postmaster and 3 other men, who apparently had heard from Henderson that there was honest work to be had in exchange for water. She stood at her gate, watching 4 men string new wire along her south fence line, and felt something she didn't have a clean name for. It wasn't gratitude, exactly, though that was part of it. It's dark. It was something more like the specific vertigo of having calculated a risk, decided to take it, and then discovered that the thing you'd hoped might happen was actually happening. She couldn't afford to trust it yet. She knew that, but she let herself register it. Forek, the work for water turned out to be more efficient than anything she could have managed or planned, because the people of Copper Hollow knew what this land needed better than she did in some respects. Eldridge Bauer, who'd done stone work for 30 years, looked at the stone outbuilding beside her house and told her the foundation was failing on the north side, and it would collapse inside 2 years if it wasn't addressed, then spent 2 days repairing it without being asked to, in exchange for water for his family. A woman named Dora Szymanski, who had 6 children and a husband who'd been sick all summer, came with her 3 oldest and spent a morning clearing and organizing the area around the wellhead, stacking stones into a low protective wall, laying flat rocks so the ground around the rim stayed firm and didn't turn to mud every time the bucket dripped. That low stone wall was the beginning of something. Other families added to it. Someone brought mortar. Someone else brought more flat stones from a collapsed fence on their own property. Within 2 weeks, the rough protective ring around the well had become a solid, careful stone circle, 3 feet high and sturdy enough that Mara could lean on it without it shifting. She hadn't asked for any of it. It just happened, the way things happen when people feel ownership over something, not legal ownership, but the deeper kind that comes from having worked on a thing and put themselves into it. Caleb said one evening, watching the Bauer boys finish a section of the stone wall by lantern light, "This is what he didn't account for." "What's that?" "That you'd make them feel like it was theirs, too." She thought about that. "I didn't do that on purpose," she said. "I know," he said. "That's probably why it worked." But Rourke wasn't finished, as Vesna had said. 2 weeks after his visit to her fence, she made a next move, and it was cleverer than the reassessment gambit, because it didn't require the county at all. He went to the families who owed him. Not all of them, and not with demands. Rourke was too careful for obvious demands. He went quietly, one by one, to the ranchers and farmers who had credit at his store or grazing agreements on his land, and he let it be known that he was considering whether those arrangements were still workable, given how things stood. He didn't say anything specific about Mara's well. He didn't need to. The message was clear enough without being spoken. 3 families stopped coming for water. She noticed it on the 4th day without them, counted the faces on the path in the morning, and found the gaps. She knew which 3 it was without asking, because she'd been paying attention. "He's pulling them," she said to Clara, who had stopped by with a delivery of preserves in exchange for the next cheese wheel. "Tatum family, Breck family, and the Cordero boy," Clara said. "Cordero's barely got enough water for himself. He's got no cattle left." Mara frowned. "What does Rourke have on him?" Cordero's grandfather borrowed money from Rourke's father 20 years ago. The debt's been passed down. Nobody ever paid it off. Nobody ever called it in. Rourke holds it like a card he's been waiting to play. Clara set a jar of preserves on the fence post with a firmness that expressed her opinion of this entire arrangement. "Perfectly legal." "Of course it is," Marissa said. She thought about it for 3 days. She went about her work, the goats and the cheese and the endless small repairs that a working ranch required. And she thought about it while she worked in the way she always did, letting the thinking happen underneath the surface of whatever her hands were doing. On the fourth day, she rode to Cordero's. He was a young man, 20 or so, with an old craftsman's wariness in his eyes and hands that were always slightly dirty with the particular clay of his section of ground. He lived alone, having lost both parents in the same fever outbreak 2 years ago. He opened his door and saw her, and something complicated happened in his expression, not hostility, stesticin, but the tension of someone who has been put in a position they didn't choose and doesn't know how to explain it. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Cordero," she said. "I'm not here about the water." He waited. "I'm here because I'd like to look at your east pasture," she said. "I've been told it has some of the best native grass base left in the county, under the surface compaction. I want to know if you'd be willing to let a portion of my goat herd graze it on rotation." He stared at her. "Why?" "Because goat grazing would break up the compaction layer and the fertilizing would accelerate the grass recovery. In 8 months, your pasture would be significantly more productive than it is now." She paused. "I'd pay a grazing fee. It wouldn't be much right now, but it would be regular." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through what she was actually offering, which was not just what she'd described, and she waited without filling the silence, because some things need to be understood without being explained. "What about Rourke?" he asked finally. Quiet, not hostile, just direct. "That's between you and Rourke," she said. "I can't solve that for you. What I can offer is something separate, a business arrangement between two landowners that doesn't have anything to do with anyone else's business." He looked at her for a long time. He had his mother's eyes. She thought, though she'd never met his mother, there was something in the steadiness of them that suggested a woman who'd raised her son to look at things clearly. "The debt," he said, "the one Rourke holds. Do you know what it would take to clear it?" She had in fact had Clara look into this. $60, she said. He let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Might as well be 600. Right now," she said, "not necessarily in 6 months." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything more because they were both people who understood that the rest of that conversation could wait until the facts changed enough to make it worth having. "The east pasture," he said. "You can bring them out and look." She brought 6 of the younger does out 2 days later and let them work the east edge of Cordero's pasture for a morning, while she and Cordero walked the fence line together, and she pointed out what the goats were doing to the soil surface and what would likely follow. He watched with the focused attentions of a young man who grew up working land and knows what healthy ground looks like and has been watching his own land struggle for long enough that seeing something improving it was almost painful. He didn't say much, but when she loaded the goats back up at the end of the morning, he said, "Same time next week?" "Same time next week," she said. The Cordero arrangement didn't directly break Rourke's hold on the young man's debt, but it changed the geometry of the situation in a way that Rourke, when he heard about it, and he would hear about it, would understand immediately. Mara was not trying to buy allies. She was trying to make herself useful to people in ways that were separate from and independent of whatever leverage Rourke held over them. You can't order someone not to take a business arrangement that benefits them if the arrangement is legitimate, not without showing your hand completely. The Tatum and Breck families came back for water 10 days after they'd stopped. Nobody's discussed it. They showed up at the gate with their buckets, and Mara noted their names and terms in her ledger, and that was the end of it. October came and the drought didn't break. The air was different now, not the blazing white heat of August and September, but a dry, relentless stillness that settled into everything, the color of straw, a thinness to the air that made people move more quietly than usual, as though the county itself was trying to conserve energy. The public well in Copper Hollow went completely dry on the 3rd of October. Mara heard about it from Clara, who rode out early that morning with a flatbed wagon and 2 hired hands and a very grim expression. "The pump's pulling air," Clara said. "Has been since midnight. DeWitt posted a notice this morning." Mara looked at the path to her ridge. At that moment, there were 9 on Fan, which was the usual morning traffic. She thought about what it would look like by noon, when the entire town understood that the public well was gone. "We need to expand the path," she said, "and we need a second rope and bucket on the well. One isn't going to be enough." "You're going to need help managing it," Clara said. "People get desperate, they don't always behave." "I know," Mara said. She thought for a moment. "Can you stay this morning?" Clara looked at her flatbed wagon, at the hands she'd brought, at the road behind her, and did a kind of rapid private calculation. Yes, she said. It was the right call. By mid-morning, the path to Briar Ridge had more traffic than it had ever carried. Families Mara had never seen before, people from the far edges of the county who'd heard from someone who heard from someone. She positioned herself at the gate and went through every arrival with the same level tone terms, arrangement through you go, and Clara stationed herself at the halfway point, on the path where it narrowed, keeping the flow orderly, and Caleb had recruited Cordero, who'd shown up unbidden with his own rope, to work the second station at the well rim. It was not smooth. Two men argued over a position in the line. A woman tried to bring 6 large barrels on a wagon that couldn't fit the path and had to turn around and come back with buckets. An old man near the back of the line became confused about the terms and grew angry, and Clara talked him down with a patience that Mara filed away for future reference, the particular skill of managing someone who is scared and expressing it as anger. But the water came up, bucket after bucket, rope over rim, cold and clear in the October morning. And the people came, and they paid what they could, and worked what they could, and were given what they needed, and nobody went home with empty hands. That evening, after the last family had gone, and the path was quiet, and the October dark was settling fast the Fayette Does in open country, Mara sat on the flat capstone, the one that had covered the well all those years, which she'd moved to the side of the ridge and now used as a seat in the evenings, and looked out over what used to be Briar Ridge. 8 acres cleared now, native grass coming in strong. On the first 5, the goats keeping it grazed at the right height so the roots could deepen. The stone outbuilding solid on its repaired foundation. New fence line on 3 sides. The cheese aging on its shelves inside. The well, open and working, the stone circle around it, neat and sturdy in the last light. She heard Caleb come up behind her. Long day, he said. Long day, she agreed. He sat down on one of the limestone rocks nearby, stretched his arms, looked out at the same view. They were both tired enough that talking required more effort than it was worth for a while, so they didn't. Then Caleb said Rourke came into town this afternoon. She looked at him. Heard it from Cordero, he said. Rourke rode in and went straight to the assessor's office. Spent about an hour. He was quiet for a moment. Cordero's friend works next door. He said when Rourke came out, he didn't look the way he usually looks. How does he usually look? Like he's already decided how things are going to go, Caleb said. Cordero's friend said this afternoon he looked like a man who's still working on it. Mara held that for a moment. He's going to make another move, she said. Yes, Caleb said, but he doesn't know what move yet, she said. That's what it sounds like. She looked back out at the ridge, at the cleared acres, and the new grass, and the stone wall around the well that 10 different families had built with their own hands, because they felt some ownership over this place now, because they'd worked here, and their names were in her ledger, and they'd drunk water from this ground during the worst drought in a decade. She thought about what Clara had said weeks ago, about how people would fold if Rourke pressured them. It was still true. It would always be at least partly true. But there was a difference between people who were connected to something only by need and people who were connected by having put themselves into it. The stone wall was going to matter. Not because it was structurally critical, though it was, but because of whose hands had made it. He can try a reassessment, she said almost to herself. He can apply political pressure. He can call in debts and scare off some of the people. She was working through it out loud, the way she did when she was tired, and her internal voice wasn't quite keeping up. But he can't take a well away from a county that's using it to survive without every family in this territory still understanding exactly what he is. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Unless he can get to the county board, he said. She looked at him. Rourke has 2 members of the county board in his pocket, he said. I don't know that for certain, but Clara thinks so. On what basis? On the basis that they've been in his pocket for years, and everyone knows it, and nobody's been able to do anything about it, because until now there's never been anything obvious enough to force the question. He looked at her. A county board can overrule a private water arrangement if they can argue public interest. That would take weeks at minimum, she said. Public notice, hearing? 6 weeks, he said. Maybe 8. Can we be in a position in 6 weeks that makes that move impossible? He thought about it honestly. I don't know, he said. That depends on whether the rain comes. They both looked up at the sky. which was the same dense, starless dark it had been all month. It'll come, she said, not because she knew, not because she was certain, but because the alternative, the drought stretching on, while Rourke worked his angles through the county board. Most of its windows were dark, while the well traffic made her visible and exposed in ways she couldn't fully control, was something she couldn't afford to dwell on and do the work at the same time. She got up from the capstone. Her body registered the full weight of the day as she stood the specific ache of hours on her feet, in her back, in her legs that were stronger than they'd been 6 months ago, but still not unlimited. She walked down the ridge in the dark, one hand on the stone wall as she passed it, the limestone cool under her palm. Behind some of its windows were Ander. Caleb sat on his rock a little longer, looking at the sky the way people look at things they can't change, hoping to find something there that will tell them how much longer they have to wait. The sky didn't answer. It never does. But the well was full, and the cheese was aging, and the fence line was tight, and for tonight, that was enough. The 6 weeks that Caleb had estimated turned out to be 5. The notice of it on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a county rider, who handed it to her at the gate with the particular expression of a man doing a job he didn't personally endorse, not apologetic enough to say so out loud, but uncomfortable enough that he couldn't quite meet her eyes. She thanked him with the same flat courtesy she'd been giving everyone lately, unfolded the paper, and read it, standing right there at the fence post. The County Board of Copper Hollow Territory hereby provided notice of a public hearing to be held on the matter of private water resource allocation during declared drought conditions with specific reference to the property known as Briar Ridge, 60 acres, owner M. Whitlock. The hearing was scheduled for 19 days from the date of the notice. All interested parties were invited to present testimony. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket alongside the other papers she'd been updating, the deed, the lawyer's notes, the term sheet she'd been updating as the arrangements evolved, and she went back to work. She didn't tell Caleb until that evening. She didn't tell Vesna until the following morning. Not because she was hiding it. Vesna would have heard about it through her own channels within 48 hours regardless, but because she needed one full day to sit with it herself before it became a thing she had to discuss and manage and plan around. The board hearing was different from Rourke's visit to her fence. That had been a direct confrontation, and direct confrontations were something she understood. This was an institutional mechanism, a formal process with rules and procedures and the specific power of official language, kind of thing designed to make private individuals feel outnumbered before they'd even walked through the door, which was, she supposed, precisely the point. Vesna, when she told her, was quiet for a long time. They were sitting at Vesna's table. It was early enough that the coffee was still good and hot, and Vesna held her cup with both hands and looked at the window and didn't say anything for long enough that Mara started to wonder if she'd miscalculated something. 2 members, Vesna said finally. 2 of the 5 board members are Rourke's. That's what Caleb heard. Which 2? Alderman Preston and Councilman Graves. Vesna nodded slowly. She set her cup down. Preston runs his cattle on Rourke's east pasture on a lease arrangement. Has for 12 years. Graves had a debt cleared by Rourke in, I think it was 1,871. Nobody talked about it at the time, but everyone knew. She looked at Mara. The other 3 are Hofstadter Monroe and Judge Calder. I know Hofstadter a little. He's bought cheese. Hofstadter is a decent man who doesn't like conflict, Vesna said. He'll go whichever way feels safest. Monroe is harder. She's an independent thinker, but she's also practical, and she doesn't like what she can't quantify. Vesna picked up her cup again. Calder is the one you need. Why Calder? Because Calder spent 30 years on a circuit court before he came to this board, and he cares about what's legally correct more than what's politically convenient. He also despises Rourke. She paused. They had a land dispute 15 years ago. Rourke won it on a technicality. Calder has never forgiven him for the method. Mara thought about that. An enemy of Rourke's isn't automatically a friend of mine. No, Vesna agreed. But it means you can talk to him on the merits and expect to be heard. The following morning, Mara rode to the county seat and asked for an appointment with Judge Calder. The clerk told her it would be 3 days. She said she'd take it. While she waited, she went back to Aldridge the lawyer and spent 2 hours going through the legal framework for the hearing, taking notes in her compact, careful handwriting, and asking questions that made Aldridge look at her with the same slightly recalibrated expression that she was getting used to seeing on people who'd initially assessed her quickly. The board's authority to regulate private water sharing arrangements is narrow, Aldridge told her, leaning back in his chair with the ink-stained collar and the look of a man who genuinely liked a complicated problem. They can regulate commercial sale of water on the grounds of public interest. But what you're doing isn't commercial sale in the standard legal sense. I charge 5 cents a bucket, she said. That's a cost recovery arrangement, not a commercial operation. You're not profitable. You're not scaled for profit. The 5 cents covers wear on the equipment and the labor of operating the well, not more. He tapped his pen on the desk. Any competent legal argument would establish that the moment you turn a meaningful profit on the water, you become subject to commercial regulations. But at 5 cents a bucket, you're not turning a profit. What about the work for water arrangements? Barter exchange. Completely standard frontier practice. No legal handle there. He leaned forward. What Rourke is actually trying to do through the board is create a public interest argument that a private individual controlling a critical water resource during a declared emergency constitutes an undue concentration of a public necessity. That argument has been used successfully in some jurisdictions. What defeats it? Aldridge looked at his desk for a moment, then back at her. Evidence that the arrangement is genuinely serving the public interest. Not just claiming to, but demonstrably. Numbers, names, testimony from the families being served. He paused. And the absence of any evidence that you're using your position for personal advantage at the community's expense. I'm not. I know. But you'll need to prove it to 3 people on that board who don't know you, one of whom will be actively looking for reasons to rule against you. She went home and started preparing documentation with the methodical thoroughness she'd applied to everything else on Briar Ridge, the same patience she'd used following goats through mesquite, the same attention to the details other people overlooked. She went through her ledger and extracted the figures. How many families served? How many buckets provided? How much charged? How much received in labor equivalents? And critically, how much water had been provided at no cost to families who had neither money nor time. The numbers were more striking than she'd realized when she was simply living them day to day. In the 6 weeks since the public well had gone dry, she had served 112 families from Copper Hollow and the surrounding territory. 43 of those families had paid in cash. 31 had paid in labor, and she listed the labor: fence repair, stonework, clearing, carpentry, cheese production assistance, road improvement on the access path. 38 families had received water free of charge. Those 38 families had between them 61 children under the age of 12. She wrote that number separately and looked at it for a while. 61 children. She brought the documentation to her meeting with Judge Calder 3 days later. Calder was a compact man in his mid-60s with a close-trimmed white beard, and the posture of someone who spent decades behind a bench upright, not from stiffness but from habit, as though the spine remembered a role the rest of the body had retired from. He looked at her across his desk with the measured attention of someone practiced at forming opinions quickly and accurately, and she made herself sit still under that attention and not explain herself preemptively, which was her instinct, but not her friend in this situation. He read through her documentation without comment. He took his time. When he finished, he set the papers on his desk with a precise alignment that suggested he'd spent 40 years putting things in their proper places. "You're not here to ask me to rule in your favor before the hearing," he said. "No, sir," she said. "I'm here to make sure you have accurate information before the hearing." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "There's a difference." "Yes. Sit down, Miss Whitlock," he said. She was already sitting, which he registered with something that might have been the very beginning of a smile. "Tell me what you believe the core legal question is. Whether a private landowner who discovers and develops a water resource on their own legally purchased property can be compelled to surrender control of that resource to county authority on the grounds of public interest when they are already voluntarily making that resource available to the public under reasonable terms." He looked at her steadily. "You've done your research." "Mr. Aldridge helped," she said. "Aldridge is competent," Calder said, which from his tone was a careful compliment. He looked at the documentation again. 38 families. Free of charge. "Yes, sir." That's going to be difficult to characterize as exploitation, he said. It wasn't directed at her. He was thinking out loud, testing the argument, the way a man tests the weight of something before committing to lift it. Preston will try the concentration of necessity angle. Graves will support him. They'll need Hofstadter or Monroe. Or both, she said. Or both, he agreed. He looked at her. What's your relationship with Agnes Monroe? I don't have one. I've seen her at the general store twice. Monroe makes decisions based on what she can verify independently, Calder said. If she has reason to visit your operation and see it functioning, her vote will follow what she observes, not what Preston tells her to think. He paused. I'm not in a position to tell you how to approach a fellow board member. But you're also not telling me, she said. This time the corner of his mouth went further. Not quite a smile, but close. You're perceptive, he said. That's going to help you and occasionally get you into trouble. She rode home with the documentation tucked back in her saddlebag and a clearer picture of the terrain ahead. Calder would vote on the merits. Hofstadter needed safety. Monroe needed to see. Preston and Graves were gone. She could spend the rest of her life building a case, and she wasn't going to get those 2 votes. She needed Hofstadter and Monroe. She had 19 days minus the 3 she'd already used. 16 days. She rode to Hofstadter's store the following morning. Arno Hofstadter was a compact German-born man in his late 50s who ran the only dry goods store within 12 miles and was therefore one of the most essential people in the county by simple geography. He had a round face that was built for warmth and used it mostly, except when he was worried, at which point warmth retreated and left a behind look of a man genuinely pained by the difficulty of a situation. He was worried now. He'd been watching the traffic on the road past his store toward Briar Ridge for 6 weeks, and he knew exactly what it meant, and Mara could tell when she walked in that he'd already been thinking hard about the board hearing because his greeting was slightly too careful. Miss Whitlock, he said, can I help you with something? A pound of salt and some coffee, she said, and 10 minutes of your time if you can spare it. He measured out the salt and the coffee with the precision of a man who has been doing this for 30 years. And when she set her money on the counter, he picked it up and held it for a moment in a way that made her think he was deciding whether to take it. He took it. 10 minutes, he said. He called to his wife in the back room to watch the counter and led Mara to a small office behind the storeroom, where there were 2 chairs and a cluttered desk and the smell of coffee from a pot on the stove. You know what I'm going to say, she said. I know what you want, he said, sitting heavily. That's not the same as knowing what you're going to say. Fair enough, she said. What I want is for the board to let my arrangement continue as it is, because it's the only thing standing between 61 children in this county and no water during a drought we don't know when it'll break. She paused. What I'm going to say is something different. I'm going to say that I understand why this is difficult for you. He looked at her. Rourke has provided reliable business to your store for years, she said. His credit is good, his orders are large, and the people who work for him shop here too. Ruling against him on the board is a business decision, not just a civic one. She kept her voice even, no edge in it. I'm not asking you to make an enemy of him for my sake. Hofstadter's round face had gone careful and still. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you to look at the numbers, she said. She put the documentation on his desk. 112 families, 61 children under 12, receiving free water. In 19 days, or 16 now, the board is going to vote on whether that continues or whether a process begins that would effectively shut it down. She tapped the papers. If it shuts down, where does that water come from? He looked at the papers but didn't pick them up. There are other sources, he said, without conviction. Name one that's currently operational within 15 miles. He couldn't. They both knew it. The creek at Rourke's North Range, she said. That's the closest water that isn't my well, and Rourke controls access to it. She let that sit. So the question the board is actually voting on isn't whether my arrangement is legally correct. It's whether the windows were dark. It's whether the water supply of Copper Hollow should be controlled by someone who charges cents a bucket and gives it free to children, or by someone who has used water access as a tool of financial leverage for 20 years. Hofstadter was quiet for a long moment. He picked up the papers. He read the numbers with the concentration of a man who needs to be certain of what he's reading before he lets himself have a reaction to it. 61 children. You're putting me in a difficult position, he said. His voice was different now. Quieter. Rourke put you in this position, she said. I'm just the one asking you to notice it. He didn't say anything after that. She left the documentation on his desk and took her salt and coffee and went home. 2 days later, she approached Agnes Munro. Munro was not a woman who used more words than she needed. She ran a small sheep operation about 4 miles north of town, had done so alone since her husband's death 8 years ago, and had a reputation in Copper Hollow for making clear, fast decisions based on observable fact, which meant she was either the most useful person on the board or the most dangerous, depending entirely on what she observed. Mara didn't go to her with papers. She sent a note through Clara asking if Munro would be willing to visit Briar Ridge on a morning of her choosing and see the operation firsthand. The note came back the following afternoon with a single line, Thursday 7 M. Munro arrived at 7 exactly, which told Mara something, on a solid gray mare that told her more. She was a lean woman, 60 or so, with windburned skin and the kind of posture that comes from decades of outdoor physical work, not rigid, but anchored, like someone whose body had found its natural relationship with gravity and made peace with it. She looked at the sign at the gate. She looked at the path. She looked at the stone wall around the well on the ridge above. She did all of this before she said a word. Walk me through it, she said. Mara walked her through it. Not the strategy, not the legal arguments, those would come in the hearing room. She walked her through the physical operation. How the well was rigged. How the bucket volume translated to rope, pulls per family. How the ledger worked. How the labor credits were tracked and assigned to actual improvements she showed Munro, the fence that Henderson had strung, the foundation repair that Bauer had done, the stone wall that a dozen families had built. Munro touched the stone wall. She ran her hand along the mortar. She looked at the workmanship with the critical eye of someone who has built and repaired things for 40 years and knows the difference between something put together quickly and something put together to last. Who built this? She asked. Bauer mostly, with help from the Shemansky boys and a few others. Eldridge Bauer, Munro said. Not a question. She knew Bauer. Yes. Munro looked at the wall for another moment. His wife's sister died in the fever outbreak 2 years ago, she said. He's been on the edge since then. 1 bad season away. I know, Mara said. Munro turned and looked at her directly for the first time that morning with the full weight of her attention. The children receiving free water. You verified the situations? Personally, Mara said. Every family. I don't take someone's word for it that they can't pay. I go and see. Something shifted in Munro's expression. Not warmth. Munro didn't trade in warmth as currency, but something that was a kind of professional respect, the recognition of a standard of rigor that she applied herself and didn't often see in others. Rourke's argument will be that you can't guarantee consistent access, Munro said. That a private individual controlling a critical resource is inherently unstable. What happens if you get sick? What happens if the well fails? What happens if you sell? I've been thinking about that, Mara said. I'm open to a formal cooperative agreement with the county, not control, but an agreement that establishes the terms of my water sharing arrangement as a binding commitment, with the county as a witness and guarantor. That would give the board something documented and enforceable, without removing the resource from my control. Munro looked at her. You'd put that in writing. I'd put it in writing, Mara said. I'd do it before the hearing. Munro nodded once, the nod of a person who has received information they needed and has filed it where it belongs. I'll see you at the hearing, she said. She turned her mare and rode back down the path. Mara stood at the top of the ridge for a moment after she left, the October morning cold now, still the same stubborn pale gray it had been for weeks. Her hands were cold. She put them in her pockets and looked at the well and the stone wall and the cleared acres below and the mesquite scrub that still covered most of the 60, and she thought about the hearing in 9 days. She rode to Aldridge the next morning, and they spent 3 hours drafting the cooperative agreement. It was not simple. Aldridge earned his feet that day, but when they finished, it was a document that committed her to maintaining reasonable access to the Briar Ridge well for county residents, under the existing terms, for a period of not less than 5 years, with the county board serving as formal witnesses to the arrangement, while explicitly preserving her ownership and control of the property and the water source. This is clever, Aldridge said, reading it back. It makes the board part of the solution, she said. instead of the mechanism of the problem. He looked at her over his reading glasses. You understand this also means the board has a stake in defending the arrangement if Ross tries to challenge it through other means. That's the idea, she said. She sent a copy of the draft agreement to Calder, to Hofstadter, and to Munro 3 days before the hearing. She did not send one to Preston or Graves, because she wasn't performing good faith toward people who had none to offer in return. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and overcast, with a quality to the air that Mara had started to recognize over these months, a faint heaviness, a denseness, as though the sky was considering something it hadn't committed to yet. She rode to the windows were dark. She rode to the county seat with her documentation and her copy of the cooperative agreement and the cold knot in her stomach that she'd been carrying for 2 weeks, and she didn't talk to Caleb much on the way, and he didn't push her to. They arrived early enough to see the room before it filled. It was a low-ceilinged county meeting room, wooden benches in rows, a long table at the front where the 5 board members would sit. It smelled of old paper and lamp oil. Mara chose a seat near the front on the right side, set her papers on her knees, and looked at the table. The room filled faster than she'd expected. Not just Rourke's people, not just her neighbors, the whole of Copper Hollow seemed to have decided this was worth a Tuesday morning. And within 20 minutes, every bench was occupied, and people were standing along the walls. She recognized faces, Tom Henderson in the 3rd row, with Ruth and the older children, Eldridge Bauer near the back, Dora Szymanski with her 3 oldest, Clara on the far left side, already watching the door with those sharp, assessing eyes. She saw Rourke come in with Preston and Graves flanking him like a formation. And she watched the way the room shifted when he entered, the specific social physics of a man who's held power in a place for a long time, the subtle reorganization of posture, the slight movement away, the few who moved toward him. He saw her. He didn't acknowledge it. He sat on the opposite side, 2 rows back, and she could feel his presence there without looking at it, the way you feel a fire in a room even when you're not facing it. Graft, the county assessor, was already at a side table with his ledgers, looking like he'd rather be underwater. The board came in together at 9 exactly, Calder in the center, Preston and Graves on the left side of the table, Hofstadter and Munro on the right. Mara watched Hofstadter sit down and open his notes and not look at Rourke. She watched Munro set her hands flat on the table and scan the room with the unhurried attention of someone taking inventory. Calder called the hearing to order with the quiet authority of a man who had run enough rooms that he no longer needed to raise his voice to fill one. This hearing concerns a petition submitted by interested parties requesting that the county board exercise regulatory authority over the private water sharing arrangement currently operating on the property known as Briar Ridge, he said. We will hear from the petitioning parties first, then from the property owner, then from any community members who wish to offer testimony. We'll proceed in order. Preston spoke first. He was a thick-set man with a practiced courtroom manner that he wore slightly wrong, the way a borrowed coat fits functional but not quite his. He made the concentration of necessity argument with the fluency of someone who'd rehearsed it, and he made it well. A private individual controlling a critical resource during a declared emergency created an unstable and potentially exploitative situation, and the county had both the right and the obligation to ensure that public necessity was not subject to private whim. It was a good argument. Mara sat still and listened to it with the same attention she'd given everything on this property, careful, complete, without the defensive agitation that would make her seem uncertain. Graves added supporting testimony that was shorter and relied heavily on the word appropriate, which he used 8 times in 4 minutes, which told Mara he was filling space rather than making a case. Then Calder looked at her. Miss Whitlock. She stood up. She did not look at Rourke. She looked at Calder, and at Munro, and at Hofstadter, and she spoke with the same level tone she'd been using for 6 months steady. Not loud, not performed, and she laid out what she'd laid out on that ridge, and in Calder's office, and in Hofstadter's back room. Except now she said it all at once, in sequence, the way a case is made when you've thought about it long enough that the logic of it has become inseparable from the facts. She talked about the 60 acres. She talked about the back taxes, the price, the work. She talked about the goats and the cleared land and the cheese and Caleb and Vesna and every neighbor who'd carried a bucket up that path. She put the numbers on the table, Read them out clearly. 112 families, 61 children, 38 receiving water free of charge, without condition, without record of their situation beyond what she needed to ensure the terms were met. Then she put the cooperative agreement on the table. In anticipation of the board's legitimate interest in the stability and continuity of this arrangement, she said, "I've prepared a formal agreement committing to the existing terms for a minimum of 5 years, with the county board named as witnesses and guarantors. I'm prepared to sign it today in this room, before this hearing concludes." The room was very quiet. Preston's face had changed. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic man, but the quality of his attention had shifted, the way a lawyer's attention shifts when the argument they prepared for has been replaced by something they didn't prepare for. Calder looked at the document. He passed it to Monroe. She read it. She passed it to Hofstetter. He read it more slowly. From the back of the room, Rourke's voice came for the first time. "This agreement is a unilateral gesture that doesn't address the underlying legal question of minor." "Mr. Rourke," Calder said, without looking up from his own copy of the document, "you'll have an opportunity to provide testimony when I call for it." The silence that followed that sentence had a particular texture. Mara felt the room register it, felt the shift in the air that happens when someone with genuine authority uses it without effort. Rourke didn't speak again. Caleb, sitting behind her, put his hand briefly on the back of her chair. He didn't touch her shoulder. That wasn't his way. But the contact with the chair, the solidity of it, was enough. She kept her eyes forward. The testimony from community members took 40 minutes. Tom Henderson went first, which she hadn't expected. She hadn't asked anyone to speak, hadn't organized testimony, had decided deliberately not to run the room that way. Henderson walked to the front with his hat in his hands and told the board in plain, specific terms what the water from Briar Ridge had meant to his family, and then he sat down. Dora Szymanski went next and described her children by name and age and said without embellishment that they would have been in serious trouble without the well. Eldridge Bauer went and talked about the stone wall, how he'd built it with materials from his own failing fence line, how it was the best stone work he'd done in years, and why. A man near the back went, who Mara didn't recognize at first, heavy-set, red-faced, with the look of someone doing something uncomfortable in public. He gave his name as Martin Doyle. He said he ran the feed store. He said that 2 months ago, when Miss Whitlock first came into Copper Hollow, he'd said something to another man while she walked past his store, and he was not going to repeat it here because it didn't deserve to be repeated, and he was sorry for it, and that was all he had to say. And he sat back down. The room was very quiet after that. Mara looked at her hands in her lap. The board deliberated for 23 minutes in a side room while the public hearing room held its collective breath. Mara sat still. Caleb sat behind her. Clara sat across the room and watched the door to the side chamber with the expression of someone who has decided to reserve judgment until all information is available. Rourke sat 2 rows back and did not move. When the board came back, Hofstadter's round face was different. The worry was still there, but it had been organized into something, sorted and resolved. Monroe's face told nothing. Calder sat and put his papers on the table and looked at the room with the calm of someone who has been in enough rooms to know that the moment before an announcement has its own particular weight, and there's no point fighting it. "The board finds," Calder said, "that the arrangement currently in operation at Briar Ridge does not constitute commercial exploitation of a public necessity and does not warrant regulatory intervention under the public interest provisions available to this body." He paused. "The board further finds that the voluntary cooperative agreement submitted by Miss Whitlock represents a model of community responsibility that this board is pleased to formalize." He looked down the table. "The motion is 3-2 in favor of the property owner. 3-2. Hofstadter had voted with her. The room started talking all at once, the sound of a space where everyone has been holding something and suddenly puts it down simultaneously. Mara sat still in the middle of it. She heard Clara's voice somewhere to her left, saying something short and satisfied. She heard Henderson's boots on the floor as he stood. She heard from 2 rows back the sound of Silas Rourke getting up and walking out, and she didn't turn to watch him go. She sat for a moment longer. Then she put her papers together, one on top of another, in the same neat stack she always made, and she put them in her bag and she stood up. Caleb was already standing. He looked at her with the quiet expression he wore when something had gone right that both of them had worked hard to make go right, and that was enough. Outside, the sky had changed. Not broke open, not yet, but the quality of the light was different from the bone-dry white of the past 2 months. There was a thickness to the clouds, a gray that had weight to it. The air had shifted slightly, a faint pressure change, the kind that animals feel before humans do. She stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the sky. Caleb came to stand beside her. "That what I think it is," he said. She didn't answer. She just looked at the clouds, the heavy gray sky above Copper Hollow, the first real weather they'd seen in months, and she felt the cold air on her face, and the weight of the morning behind her, and the ground under her feet that she'd earned by every metric she knew to apply to earning. Inside the courthouse, she could hear voices, the sound of people talking about what had just happened and what it meant, and somewhere in that sound was the beginning of something she couldn't yet fully see, the shape of a county that had been organized one way for 20 years, starting to reorganize itself around a different point. She wasn't ready to think about that yet. She just stood on the steps and looked at the sky and breathed the changed air and let the moment be what it was without pushing it toward the next thing. The first drop hit the dust in the road below the steps, then another. Then, tentatively, a few more, the hesitant opening of something that had been held back a long time. She didn't move. She let it hit her face, her coat, her hands. Caleb stood beside her, and neither of them said anything because after the morning they'd had, rain felt like its own complete sentence, and adding words to it would have been exactly the wrong thing. Behind them, through the courthouse doors, the voices inside went suddenly quiet as the people in the room heard it too. The sound on the roof, the sound on the road, the sound that Copper Hollow had been waiting for since August. And somewhere across town, in the direction of Briar Ridge, 60 acres of cleared and half-cleared and still working land were receiving the first rain of the season, and the native grass that had been coming in on the first 5 acres caught it the way land that has been prepared catches water. Not running off, not pooling uselessly, but soaking in, going down, feeding what was underneath. Mara Whitlock stood in the rain outside a courthouse where she had just won, and she was still the same person who'd stepped off the stage in Copper Hollow 7 months ago with one carpet cart bag and $40 and an idea that everyone told her was foolish. And she had not changed in any of the ways that people in stories are supposed to change, had not become someone different or discovered hidden reserves of some quality she hadn't previously possessed. She was tired and her feet hurt and she was hungry and her back ached from sitting rigid on a courthouse bench for 2 hours. But she was standing on her own 2 feet on ground that was legally, irrevocably, and now also formally hers, in the rain. And that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything she'd come here for. The rain lasted 3 days. Not the violent crashing kind that does more damage than good. The kind that fills arroyos too fast and runs off before the ground can use it. But a steady, patient rain that fell at the pace the land could actually absorb. The kind of rain that old-timers called a soaking rain, a working rain. The kind that gets down past the clay crust and into the root zone where it actually does something. Mara spent the first day indoors, which was unusual for her. She sat at her table with her ledger and her documentation and the signed cooperative agreement, now bearing the county seal and called her signature, and she listened to the rain on the roof of the stone house and tried to figure out what she felt. She was not, it turned out, as relieved as she'd expected to be. Relief implies that the danger picture is past, and she understood well enough that Rourke's 3-2 defeat at the county board was not the end of anything. Men like Rourke didn't end. They recalibrated. He would find another angle, another mechanism, another slowly tightening arrangement of legalities and debts and quiet pressures that would take years to fully assemble itself into a threat she could see clearly. That was how he operated, and a single board hearing wasn't going to change his fundamental nature any more than clearing 5 acres and had changed the fundamental character of the mesquite scrub that still covered 40 of her 60. What she felt, sitting with the rain on the roof and the ledger on the table, was something more like clarity. The specific, slightly exhausted clarity of a person who has been in a sustained, difficult situation long enough that they've stopped wondering if they can manage it and started simply managing it, day by day, problem by problem, The way you eat through a hard winter one meal at a time, not thinking too far ahead. She was still here. The land was still hers. The well was still working. The agreement was signed and filed. Those were the facts of where she stood, and for a woman who had arrived in Copper Hollow 7 months ago with $40 and a plan that sounded foolish, those facts were not nothing. On the second day of rain, Vesna came. She arrived mid-morning, dripping with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the expression of someone who has been thinking about something for days and has decided it's time to say it out loud. Mara put coffee on, and they sat at the table, and for a while neither of them said anything, just sat with the rain on the windows and the warmth of the stove. "I've been in this county 30 years, Vesna said eventually. Mara waited. "I came from Bohemia with my husband in 1843, Vesna said. "We had nothing when we arrived that wasn't worth nothing. The land we found was worse than yours, if you can imagine it." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "People here were not kind to us. Not cruel, mostly. Just certain we would fail. Certain enough that they didn't bother hiding it." "Did they ever stop being certain?" Mara asked. "No," Vesna said simply. "They just stopped being right. There's a difference." She looked at the rain on the window. "My husband died in 1859. Fever. By that time we had built something real, something that didn't depend on anyone else's opinion of whether we should have built it." She paused, "But I was afraid after he died that I would lose it. Not to Rourke. Rourke wasn't the power he became until later. To the simple fact of being alone and old and a foreigner in a county that still, in some part of its thinking, wasn't sure I belonged." Mara looked at her. "I didn't lose it," Vesna said, "but I spent years being afraid I would. Years of managing the fear, working around it, never quite being able to set it down." She turned from the window. "I don't want that for you. I want you to understand something that took me a very long time to understand." "What's that?" "That belonging to a place is not a thing other people give you," Vesna said. "You can't wait for the county to decide you're one of them. You can't wait for Rourke to acknowledge that you've won. You can't wait for the last person who laughed at you to apologize." She held Mara's gaze steadily. "You belong to this land because you worked it and you know it and it knows you. That's already happened. Nobody's vote changes it." Mara sat with that. "Martin Doyle apologized," she said after a moment. "At the hearing, I heard," Vesna said. "Was it enough?" Mara thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "but it was something." Vesna nodded. "That's the right answer," she said. "It's something. Not everything. You don't have to make it everything." She picked up her cup. The wrong answer would have been either yes, completely, or no, nothing. Both of those are lies. They sat for another while, and the rain kept coming, and Mara thought about what Vesna had said about belonging, turning it over the way you turn a piece of ground over, with a fork not to find anything specific, just to see what's there. She thought about the stone wall. The families who had built it with materials from their own properties, who had brought mortar and flat stones and their own labor to a piece of ground that wasn't theirs and made something permanent on it. She thought about the cooperative agreement with the county seal and whether that counted as belonging, or whether Vesna was right, that belonging was something else entirely, something that had already happened without anyone voting on it. She thought, too, about Rourke. On the third day of rain, she rode out to look at the land. The cleared 5 acres had gone from the pale straw color of drought-stressed grass to something greener, the color coming up fast the way it does when the root system is already there and only needed water to express itself. The native grama grass that Caleb had first spotted in that circular patch months ago had spread considerably. She could see it now running in loose networks between the exposed limestone, finding the lines of better soil and running along them. The mesquite on the uncleared sections was heavy with rain, and she walked its edge and looked into the dense tangle of it and thought about the goats, about what 40 or 50 more acres of this would look like cleared, about how long it would take and what it would yield. She was not a romantic about land she'd been in it. Long enough to know it doesn't cooperate with romance, but she felt something when she looked at those cleared 5 acres that she hadn't felt about any place before. A kind of investment that wasn't financial, or wasn't only financial. She had put herself into this ground, and it had started slowly and incompletely, and with no guarantees to put something back. When she came back down to the house, Caleb was in the yard, patching the lean-to roof that had started leaking in the rain. He worked with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything, and when he heard her come through the gate, he kept working, which she had come to appreciate about him. He didn't perform attention, he just gave it to whatever needed it most. Cordero was here while you were out, he said. What did he need? He brought something. Caleb nodded toward the porch. There was a burlap sack sitting against the house wall. Didn't say what it was, just left it. She opened the sack. Inside were 6 glass jars, sealed, containing something pale and thick. She opened one and smelled it, rendered tallow clean, good quality, no off smell. A useful thing, hard to come by, expensive. She put the lid back on. There was no note. Cordero wasn't a man who wrote notes, apparently. He'd just driven something valuable over in the rain and left it on her porch and gone home. She stood looking at the 6 jars for a moment, and then she carried them inside and put them on the shelf next to the cheese rounds and thought about what it meant that a young man with an old debt and no cattle and a pasture that was just starting to recover had brought her rendered tallow in the rain. She thought it meant something that wasn't in the cooperative agreement and wasn't in the county board's decision and wasn't anything Rourke could challenge or Calder could formalize. It was the kind of meaning that accrues slowly without announcements in the accumulation of small transactions between people who are starting to understand that they are connected to each other whether they planned it or not. The rain stopped on the 4th morning. The sky that came after it was the particular washed blue of post-rain country, the color that makes everything look sharper and more itself than it did before, as though the rain had cleaned not just the air but the eye. The goats penned during the wet days were loudly and comprehensively expressing their opinion of their confinement, and Mara opened the gate early and let them out and watched them move into the cleared section with the cheerful, unreflective energy of animals for whom the world had just gotten significantly more interesting. Stone, the old buck, went directly to the limestone outcropping at the high point of the ridge, and stood on it in the morning sun and looked out over the territory with the expression of an animal that has decided it owns everything in its line of sight. He had this expression often. It had stopped being amusing and become simply characteristic, like the creak in the second step of the porch or the particular sound the west gate made when the wind was from the north. She was standing watching the herd when she heard riders on the road. Not one rider, too, moving at a pace that said business rather than passing through. She went to the fence and looked and didn't recognize either of them, which was unusual enough in the post-hearing weeks that it made her pay attention. They slowed when they reached her gate, and the one in front, a compact man in a clean coat, looked at the sign and then at her. Miss Whitlock? Yes. I'm Harmon County Land Office, Uvalde. He produced a folded document from his coat. I've been authorized to deliver this. She took it. She unfolded it. She read it standing at the fence. It was an offer to purchase, submitted through the Uvalde County Land Office for 60 acres known as Briar Ridge, at a price that was nearly 4 times what she'd paid. The offer was clean and formal and made no explicit reference to the well or the recent hearing or anything that would connect it to the man she was certain had generated it. It was from a land holding company called Meridian Valley Properties, which she'd never heard of, and which, if Aldridge's knowledge of regional property law was as good as she thought it was, probably didn't exist as a genuine independent entity at all. She refolded the document. Who submitted this? She asked. I'm just the delivery man, Harmon said. Is there a contact name for the purchasing entity? He shifted in his saddle in a way that told her what she needed to know, without him having to say it. The contact is through our office, he said. She handed the paper back to him. Not for sale, she said. He looked at the paper and then at her. The offer is— I understand the offer, she said. Briar Ridge is not for sale at any price. Please communicate that to whoever is asking. He took the paper back. He and his companion exchanged a look that she didn't try to read, and then they rode back the way they'd come. She watched them go. Caleb came up beside her. He'd been in the yard and had seen the exchange. What was that? Rourke, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Through an intermediary this time. Through an intermediary this time, she said, which means the direct approach is off the table and he knows it. She turned back toward the house. He's not going to stop trying, but he's running out of mechanisms that don't make him obviously who he is. Is that enough? Caleb asked. Just running him out of mechanisms? She thought about it. It is for now, she said. I don't need him to stop wanting this land. I need him to not be able to take it. Those are different problems. What she didn't say, because she wasn't certain enough of it yet to say it out loud, was that she thought Rourke's position in Copper Hollow was shifting in ways that went beyond her specific situation. She'd been watching it for weeks, the small social recalibrations that happen in a community when the power structure they've arranged themselves around starts to look less permanent than it did before. The families who'd built the stone wall, the testimony in the courthouse, Hofstadter's vote, which had cost him sumps, and he'd done it anyway. Cordero's tallow, Martin Doyle standing up in the hearing room and saying what he'd said. None of these things had been coordinated. None of them had been arranged. They'd happened because people given a situation where the right thing was also the visible thing often do the right thing. Not always, and not dramatically, and not without cost, but often enough to matter. Rourke's power had always depended on a particular kind of invisibility. The debts were private. The pressure was quiet. The mechanism was below the surface. What the past months had done, inadvertently, was bring some of that mechanism to the surface where it could be seen. And things that can be seen can be named, and things that can be named can eventually be refused. He wasn't finished. She knew that, but he was, for the first time in 20 years in this county, slightly less certain than he'd been before. And certainty, she'd come to understand, was the actual currency Rourke traded in. Not land, not water, not money certainty. The absolute conviction, communicated to everyone around him, that he would eventually get what he wanted. When that conviction cracked, even slightly, the whole arrangement it supported became less stable. She was living evidence that it could crack. A week after the rain, she had her most sustained conversation with Clara about what came next. Clara had come out on the pretext of returning a pot she'd borrowed, which was a real errand, but not the real reason, and they sat on the porch in the thin November sun with coffee and a wheel of cheese that Mara had been aging for 8 weeks, and which had turned out remarkably well, complex and sharp with the limestone note that Vesna had first identified as the particular character of this ground. Clara ate a piece of cheese and said nothing about it for a moment. Then she said, "This is significantly better than the first batch." "The first batch was terrible," Mara said. "The second was worse," Clara said. "But yes, this is good. This is something people will buy at a real price." "I've been thinking about that," Mara said, "about what this could become at scale. Not at Briar Ridge scale, at something larger." She looked out at the cleared land, at the goats working the edge of the remaining scrub. "If the land reclamation keeps going at the rate it's been going, by spring I could have 30 clear acres. That's enough to run a herd 3 times the current size. Where would you get the animals?" Vesna's contact in Laredo still owes her favors, apparently. She mentioned it last week. Mara wrapped her hands around her cup. "The cheese market is limited here, but the county seat is different. There's a hotel there, 2 boarding houses, a restaurant. If the quality is consistent, Agnes Munro," Clara said. Mara looked at her. "Munro sells her wool through a merchant in the county seat," Clara said. "She has a relationship with the merchant that's been solid for 8 years. He handles agricultural products, wool, preserved goods, specialty items." Clara set her cup down. "If you wanted an introduction, I think Munro would provide one. After what happened at the hearing, she might even advocate." Mara thought about Agnes Munro's hand on the stone wall, the way she'd run her fingers along the mortar, the single nod she'd given at the end of the Briar Ridge tour. "I'll talk to her," Mara said. "There's something else," Clara said. Her tone had changed slightly, taken on the particular quality it got when she was about to say something she'd thought about a great deal before deciding to say it. "Hofstadter is in trouble." Mara looked at her sharply. "Not Rourke directly," Clara said. "The drought. He extended credit to too many families during the worst months. And now the debt is, he's not going to call it in. He's not that kind of man, but his own creditors are circling. He may have to reduce his inventory significantly, which means the people who depend on his store are going to feel it. What does he need? A reliable supplier for things he currently imports at high cost," Clara said. "Specifically, high-quality preserved goods. Cheese, rendered goods, preserved meats, things that don't require refrigeration and sell reliably." She paused. "He mentioned it to me last week. Not as a business proposition, just talking. The way people talk when they're worried." Mara set her cup down and looked at the cheese wheel on the table between them and understood what Clara was actually telling her. You're suggesting I approach him, she said. I'm suggesting you think whether you have something he needs and whether a supply arrangement would be mutually beneficial, Clara said. I'm not suggesting anything specific. That is a specific suggestion, Mara said. Yes, Clara agreed. It is. Mara went to Hofstadter the following week with a sample of the aged cheese and a simple written proposal, a 6-month supply arrangement, consistent volume, price fixed for the term, quality guaranteed or no payment. She sat across from him in the same back office where she'd sat 2 months before, and she put the proposal on the desk between them and the cheese beside it, and she didn't embellish or persuade. He tasted the cheese. He read the proposal. He ate a second piece of cheese more slowly. Your production capacity at current scale, he said. 2 wheels a week, reliably. Potentially 3 by spring. At this quality? At this quality or I don't send it. He looked at her. What do you need from me? A fair price and a commitment for 6 months, she said, that we see. He put his hand out. She shook it. It wasn't a complicated negotiation, and she thought later that the reason it wasn't complicated was that both of them had been through enough complicated things recently to appreciate when something was simply straightforward. He needed what she had. She needed what he could provide. The rest was arithmetic. The supply arrangement with Hofstadter changed the financial landscape of Briar Ridge in ways she hadn't entirely anticipated. Not dramatically, she wasn't suddenly prosperous, and she had no illusions about that, but steadily, the way things change when a reliable income stream gets added to an operation that has been running entirely on margin. It meant she could pay Caleb a real wage instead of the approximate wage she'd been paying. It meant she could budget for the spring expansion of the goat herd. It meant she could start accumulating the kind of reserve that would let her weather the next crisis without gambling everything on a single decision. She paid Cordero's debt to Rourke in December. Not all of it. $60. $60 was $60. And she didn't have $60 to spend. She had it to spend on something that she'd been calculating the value of for 2 months. She went to the county land office and asked what was required to formally clear the debt record, and she paid it and received the documentation, and she rode out to Cordero's that afternoon and gave it to him. He stood in his doorway and looked at the paper for a long time. He was the kind of young man who didn't show a lot on his face, which she'd come to understand was a learned self-protection. The face of someone who'd been disappointed enough that expression had become a thing to manage carefully. I didn't ask for this, he said. No, she said. Why? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because you brought tallow in the rain, she said, and because you helped at the well without being asked. And because Rourke holding that debt was a way of keeping you from making clear decisions. I don't need you making decisions for me. I need you making decisions for yourself. That's a better neighbor. He looked at the paper again. Then he folded it with the precision of someone who intends to keep a thing safe for a very long time. The East Pasture arrangement, he said. I'd like to expand it. I was going to propose the same thing, she said. They worked out the expanded arrangement, standing in his doorway in the December cold. And when they were done, he offered her coffee, and she said yes. And they sat at his table and talked for an hour about the land and the drought and the spring and what the county looked like when it wasn't in crisis. And it was the most straightforward conversation she'd had with anyone since she arrived. Easy in the way conversations are easy when neither person is performing anything or protecting anything, and the business between them is already settled. She told him about the cheese arrangement with Hofstadter. He told her about his grandfather, the one who'd originally taken the money from Rourke's father, what the man had been trying to do with it, how it had gone wrong, how the debt had been passed down like a piece of furniture nobody wanted, but nobody knew how to get rid of. My grandfather wasn't a fool, Corderosa said. He was just in a situation where the only person offering help was the wrong person to take it from. That's most bad debt, she said. Yeah, he said. I think that's right. She rode home in the late afternoon, the December light slanting gold across the cleared acres, the goats penned already for the evening, the stone house with smoke rising from the chimney because Caleb had come back earlier and started the stove. She sat on her horse at the top of the ridge for a moment, the way she'd done on that borrowed horse 7 months ago when she'd first looked at this tangle of mesquite and rock and told herself that beginning was the most important part. The view was different now. Not finished, nothing out here was finished, and the 40 acres, still covered in scrub, made that plain but different in the way that things are different when work has been done on them, and the work shows. The stone wall around the well. The fence lines that were tight and straight where they'd been sagging and rotting. The house itself, with its repaired foundation and its patched roof, and its smoke. The cleared land running in a rough sweep from the ridge. Down to the east, the native grass beginning to hold it together, the soil starting to build. She'd come here hoping to survive independently. She had managed more than that, and the thing that had made it more wasn't a discovery or a victory or a single dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of small decisions, each one made on the ground she was actually standing on, rather than the ground she wished she were standing on. The goats instead of the axe. The well opened instead of hidden. The water shared instead of hoarded. Cordero's debt paid not as charity, but as an investment in the kind of neighbor she wanted to have. None of those decisions had felt certain when she made them. That was the thing she'd learned that she hadn't known when she arrived. Certainty is not a prerequisite for good judgment. You can be genuinely uncertain and still make the right call if you're paying close enough attention to what's actually in front of you. She hadn't known the well was there when she bought the land. She hadn't known the goats would work as well as they did, or that Vesna would become what she'd become, or that Caleb would be the person he turned out to be. Most of its windows were dark. She hadn't known that sharing the water would build community faster than hoarding it would have built security. She'd made each of those decisions with incomplete information, under pressure, without a net. What she'd had, and what she still had, was the ability to look at a situation steadily and decide on what was actually there rather than what she feared or hoped was there. That wasn't a talent. It wasn't a gift. It was a practice. The same way the cheese was a practice and the goat management was a practice, something you learned by doing it badly first, and then less badly, and then eventually well enough. She dismounted and walked the horse down to the stable, and Caleb came out to meet her and took the horse without being asked. And she walked to the house and hung her coat and sat at the table where her ledger was open to the current week's page. The numbers were better than they'd been last week. Next week they would be better still. She didn't close the ledger. She'd learned not to close it until she'd checked everything twice, because the second check always found something the first missed. But she sat for a moment before starting it, hands flat on the table, and let herself register the quietness of the house and the smoke from the stove and the sound of the goats settling for the night outside. There was one thing left unfinished. She'd been avoiding thinking about it directly. The way you avoid looking at something that hurts to look at, but it was there, and she knew it was there, and she's not, fundamentally, a person who left things unfinished by looking away from them. She put on her coat again and went out and saddled the horse again and rode into Copper Hollow in the December evening and went to Martin Doyle's feed store. He was closing up when she arrived, flipping the sign and locking the front case. He saw her through the window and his face did something complicated. He unlocked the door. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Doyle," she said. "You have a minute?" He stepped back from the door, which was an answer. She came in and stood in the middle of the store, which smelled of grain and leather, and the particular dusty warmth of a place that has been heated all day and is just starting to cool. She looked at him directly, the way she'd been looking at people directly since she got here, because she'd learned early that looking away gives the other person permission to say whatever they want and pretend you agreed to it. At the hearing, she said, "What you said. I want you to know I heard it." He shifted his weight. He was clearly uncomfortable, and she didn't feel inclined to ease that discomfort, but she also didn't feel inclined to make it worse than it needed to be. She'd thought carefully about what she wanted to say here, on the ride in, and she knew what it was. "I can't tell you it doesn't matter," she said. It did matter. It still matters somewhat. "I'm not going to stand here and say it's fine." She paused. "But I can tell you that what you did in that room was harder than what most people in that room did, because most of them just had to decide whether to support me or oppose me. You had to decide whether to name what you'd done wrong. That's harder." He looked at his hands. "It wasn't what I said that morning. When you first came, it wasn't. You don't have to explain it," she said. "I know what it was. I've been hearing versions of it my whole life." She said this without particular bitterness, because bitterness would have been a performance, and she was too tired for performances. I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm telling you I heard you at the hearing. That's what I came to say." He looked at her. He had the face of a man who had been expecting to receive something and had instead been given something, and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. "I buy my supplies from the county seat," she said after a moment. "Feed, mainly, and hardware. I'd rather buy them locally if the price is comparable." He stared at her for a moment. "I can match county seat prices on most things," he said slowly. "Then I'll come by next week with a list," she said. "Good evening, Mr. Doyle." She left before he could say anything more, because she'd said what she came to say, and she didn't need the conversation to go further than that. Not every wound closes clean. Not every apology is sufficient, and not every apology is refused either. There's a range of things between those two positions, and she had found one of them, and that was enough for tonight. She rode home in the dark. The stars were out, the post-rain sky washed clear, the kind of winter night that makes the country look like it goes on forever, in every direction, which it mostly does. She rode without hurrying, letting the horse pick its pace, and she thought about Vesna's words, that belonging was not something other people gave you, and she thought about whether she believed that. She did. She decided. She believed it, but she also believed that belonging was not entirely internal, not entirely a matter of what you'd decided about yourself. It was built between people, slowly, in the accumulation of small things, a stone wall built by 10 different families, tallow left on a porch in the rain, a man standing up in a public room and saying something he didn't have to say. It was two-directional belonging. It came from inside and it came from outside, and when those two things started moving toward each other, something real was built at the place where they met. That was what was being built in Copper Hollow. Not fast, not cleanly, not without backsliding and uncertainty, and the ongoing presence of people like Rourke, who would spend their whole lives trying to make sure only some people got to belong, but being built, stone by stone, decision by decision, bucket by bucket. She got back to Briar Ridge and put the horse up and went inside and sat at her table and opened her ledger to the place she'd left it. She checked the numbers twice, as she always did. Then she closed it and banked the stove for the night and went to bed. Outside, the December wind moved across the cleared acres of Briar Ridge, through the native grass that was already deeper rooted than it looked, past the stone squalls, the stone wall, and the 50-some-odd goats, making the time sounds in the pen, past the fence lines that were tight where they'd been sagging, across the 40 acres of mesquite scrub that was still waiting to become whatever the work would make it. The land didn't know what had happened to it, or what it was becoming, or what it had once been worth by other people's calculations. It was just land. It didn't care about board hearings, or property assessments, or the question of who belonged where. But it held water 50 feet down, deep in the limestone, cold and clean and very old, and it had been holding it patiently since long before anyone came to fight over it. Mara Whitlock had come to this country with one bag and $40 and an idea that sounded foolish, and she had found the water, and she had made it available, and she had not let it be taken. And that was the whole of it. Not more than that, not less. It was enough to have done. It was enough to be the person who did it. She slept soundly, for the first time. In a long time, with the winter wind in this mesquite, and the well full of cold water down in the dark, waiting for morning, the way good things wait quietly, and for as long as it takes.